Shane's fearless. Don't know if he fears anything. Shane's actually doing his thing from a cell that's 4 feet higher than the one that I did. And for those people out there, dismissing what he did
Undertaker was better? That is the question that floats around every single time someone brings up Mick Foley's list of the 6 toughest wrestlers he ever faced. And it is a fair one. The Undertaker is one of the most iconic wrestlers to ever step between the ropes. He is physically enormous. He carries an aura that very few performers in any era have ever been able to match. And he spent 30 years grinding through some of the most brutal moments ever put on pay-per-view and television. His reputation is real. His legacy is untouchable. So when fans hear that Mick Foley, the most famous hardcore wrestler in the history of the sport, has a definitive list of the 6 toughest wrestlers he ever encountered, the natural assumption is that The Undertaker is sitting comfortably near the top of it, maybe even owning the whole thing. After all, if anyone in wrestling history looks like the definition of toughest, it is the dead man. But Foley's list does not work that way. And the more you dig into the 6 names he keeps coming back to, across his books, his podcast, Foley is Pod, and most recently in a detailed 2025 conversation with Chris Van Vliet, the more you understand why. Foley's framework for toughness has 3 main components. Real fighting ability, the kind that exists entirely outside the script and outside the ring, the kind that has nothing to do with storylines or kayfabe. Physical impact, the ability to hit and to be hit in a way that leaves permanent consequences. And psychological tolerance, the capacity to absorb suffering and keep moving forward without flinching. His list is built on all 3 of those pillars, and every person who made it represents a distinct variation of them. And if you want to push this video up, tap hype right now. Just a quick tap, takes 2 seconds. Back to the countdown. The 6 names Foley returns to, consistently, are Haku, Big Van Vader, Harley Race, the Steiner brothers, Terry Funk, and Shane McMahon. None of them are The Undertaker. That is not a dismissal of Taker. It is simply the result of applying Foley's actual framework honestly, and understanding that gap between what popular perception expects and what Foley actually experienced is what makes this list so worth going through. The question on the thumbnail deserves a direct response before we get into the names. The Undertaker is a legend. His toughness is real. No one who has watched his career seriously would question that. But Foley's list was never about overall greatness in the traditional sense. It was built around specific, lived, physical encounters. Moments when Foley went to work with someone and came out the other side genuinely changed by the experience. That is the measuring stick, not title reigns, not character work, not crowd responses. What it actually felt like to be in the ring with someone. Every single person on this countdown did something to Foley that stayed with him. These 6 names are not ranked by who would win a fight in some abstract sense. They are ranked by the specific quality of toughness that Foley associated with them. Counting down from number 6 to number 1, number 6, Haku. If you are newer to wrestling history and you have not come across the Haku stories before, you need to prepare yourself. Because Haku, it also known as Meng in WCW, is not famous for championship reigns. He is not famous for a great rivalry or a landmark feud. Haku is famous for one thing above all others, and that is the unanimous, uncontested acknowledgement of everyone who ever shared a locker room with him that he was the most physically dangerous human being in any room he walked into. Not dangerous in a character sense. Not dangerous because a promoter told you he was on television. Dangerous in the most literal, most real, most direct sense of that word. Mick Foley has said many times that the wrestling world is full of tough people. The business filters for it. You do not last in professional wrestling if you are genuinely fragile. But Foley's position on Haku is that he operates on a completely different plane from even other legitimate tough men in the industry. Foley says Haku exists somewhere entirely his own. And once you hear the specifics, that framing stops feeling like hyperbole. The most documented piece of evidence for Haku's real-world capability is a bar altercation. During this incident, Haku was being maced and handcuffed by law enforcement. Steel handcuffs, standard restraints. Haku snapped them, not loosened them through sustained effort, snapped them through raw physical torque as a direct response to the situation. That alone would be enough to make the point. But the same incident, or a closely related one, depending on the telling, also involved Haku reaching into someone's mouth and removing their teeth using only his bare fingers, not knocking them out, removing them with his hands. Well, and that sounds like the kind of story that gets embellished over years of telling and retelling in locker rooms. Except every credible person who was around the wrestling business in that era repeats it consistently. The details do not change. Nobody disputes it. Veterans who had seen everything accepted it as fact. Then there is the July 1990 incident, documented by wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer at the time it happened. In a confrontation, it reportedly took 6 police officers to subdue Haku. 6. And during that struggle, Haku bit a chunk out of the back of one of those officers. This was not a small officer. The man was approximately 6'6" and weighed around 280 pounds, and he had a background as a professional boxer. He had to be examined at a hospital afterwards because of the injury Haku inflicted. Mick Foley's reading of these incidents is not simply admiration for wild behavior. He views them as evidence of something physiological. Haku, in his assessment, had access to a biological gear for combat that most human beings simply do not possess. Not trained, not developed through preparation, something that was part of who he was at a fundamental level. And that understanding is what puts Haku on this list. The final piece of the Haku argument comes through Andre the Giant. Andre spent most of his career being the largest and most physically dominant figure in professional wrestling. He walked into every locker room in every country for decades and was always the most imposing person present. Very few things in the world made Andre feel threatened. But Foley has noted that Andre reportedly feared only 2 men in that locker room. One was Harley Race, the other was Haku. Think about what that means. A 500-pound man who had spent decades as the industry's primary attraction, a man who had seen everything and everyone the wrestling world had to offer. That man went out of his way to be cautious around Haku, not to avoid him necessarily, to recognize him as a legitimate threat in the most real sense. Foley considers that the definitive validation of Haku's status. If Andre felt it, the assessment is beyond argument. The Undertaker comparison here is the first point at which the thumbnail question begins to get its answer. When people say The Undertaker should be on a list like this, they are usually talking about his screen presence, his character, the aura he creates through decades of commitment to a persona. That is real, and it is genuinely impressive. It takes enormous craft and discipline to sustain, but Haku's danger was not constructed. There was no persona involved. Haku walked into a room and the atmosphere shifted because of what people knew, not what they had seen on television. 6 police officers and a pair of steel handcuffs found out the truth of it firsthand. That is a different category from being great at a character. Haku is the foundation of this list because he represents the most primal version of the quality Foley is examining. Before technique, before training, before experience, there is the simple question of how dangerous a person actually is. Haku answered that question in a way that no one else on this list, and no one in the industry, answered it in quite the same way. From number 6, we move to the man who took toughness out of the car park and into the ring in the most physical, most permanent way imaginable. Number 5, Big Van Vader. If Haku was the man you feared running into outside the ring, Big Van Vader was the man you feared once you were inside it. Foley has been consistent about this across every interview and every retelling across his entire career. Vader was the hardest-hitting opponent he ever faced. Not the most technically gifted, not the most menacing in terms of character presentation, the hardest-hitting, as in the specific physical impact of what Vader delivered in a match was unlike anything Foley absorbed from anyone else. And he absorbed a remarkable amount from a remarkable number of people over a very long time. Leon White, who performed as Big Van Vader, was a massive man. He carried well over 400 pounds on his frame, and unlike many larger wrestlers who slow down to manage that weight, he moved with genuine speed and hit with full force. There is extensive documented evidence of what the combination of those two things felt like for the person across from him in the ring. Foley and Vader worked together repeatedly in World Championship Wrestling in the early 1990s. And those matches produced consequences that went well beyond what most people understand when they hear the phrase working stiff. The first major encounter came in April of 1993. Vader delivered a powerbomb to Foley on a surface that was essentially a concrete floor, covered with minimal padding. The result was a real concussion and a loss of sensation that was not theatrical. Lost sensation. That was April. And by October of the same year, they had a Texas death match at Halloween Havoc that Foley has described as one of the most physically brutal contests of his career. Two encounters in 1 year, each more damaging than most wrestlers accumulate across a full calendar of work. But the defining moment, the one that permanently altered Foley's body and became one of the most documented stories in wrestling history, happened on March the 16th, 1994, in Munich, Germany. During that match, Foley attempted a move called a hangman spot. The mechanics involved entwining his head and neck between the ring ropes in a way designed to look dramatic and dangerous to the crowd watching. What made it actually dangerous that night was the specific construction of the ropes themselves. CW at that time was using elevator cables wrapped in rubber casing rather than standard hemp or traditional cable ropes used elsewhere. These ropes had no flexibility, no give. When weight pressed against them, they did not yield. As Foley's body weight carried him over those ropes, his neck became caught in a grip that tightened with every shift of his body. The cables began pressing directly against his carotid arteries. These are the arteries that carry blood from the heart to the brain. Foley has described the specific moment of realizing that if he remained where he was facing brain damage or death. Not a dramatic exaggeration of that fear, the actual, immediate physical reality of it. He wrenched his head free with everything he had, and in doing so, he tore through his own cartilage, losing 2/3 of his right ear in the process. He then continued the match. During a subsequent exchange of heavy blows with Vader, the remaining portion of the ear was completely detached. It ended up on the blue protective mat at ringside. That image became one of the most iconic and widely circulated in the history of professional wrestling, and Foley finished the match. Now here is the part of the Vader story that Foley always makes sure to include, because it matters to understanding the full picture. Leon White, the man behind the Vader character, was by all accounts a sensitive and emotionally open person away from the ring. Foley has spoken about an incident where Vader accidentally caused a serious injury to a young wrestler named Joe Thurman, who eventually recovered. In the immediate aftermath, Leon White, a man who outweighed most people by a significant margin, sat in the dressing room and cried. He was genuinely devastated by what had happened. That was Leon White. When the match started, White stepped aside. What replaced him was something that operated without adjustment or restraint. Foley has used the phrase sensitive monster to describe the split precisely because it captures both sides. Leon White cried in the dressing room over an accidental injury. Vader took 2/3 of an ear in Munich and kept swinging. The same man. Two entirely different operating modes. Foley has said he valued Vader's stiffness because it made his Cactus Jack character look genuinely resilient. When the crowd sees someone who clearly hits the way Vader hit, and they watch you keep getting up, they believe in you. But the physical cost was real in a way that extended far beyond any single performance. That right ear has never been fully repaired. The cartilage lost on a mat in Germany in March of 1994 is simply gone. The Undertaker comparison in the context of Vader is about a specific thing. When fans say Undertaker belongs on this list, they often point to the 1998 Hell in a Cell. That match was brutal and genuinely dangerous in specific ways. But Foley's Vader encounters produced a real concussion and loss of sensation, a match he described as one of the most brutal of his career and the permanent loss of most of his right ear. 3 matches, 3 different categories of permanent damage. When Foley says Vader hit the hardest, the evidence is written on his body. From number 5, we step into someone whose toughness is built on something older and in some ways more fundamental than anything we have covered so far. Number 4, Harley Race. Harley Race represents a kind of toughness that is harder to define than the others because it covers more than one dimension. He is not simply a physical specimen or a legitimate fighter in the traditional sense. He is a man whose entire existence appears to have been shaped by surviving things that were supposed to stop him, and who carried that survival into every room he ever walked into as a form of constant, quiet authority. Race was a multiple-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, which in the territory era was the most significant title in the business. But the title reigns are almost secondary when you understand what his peers actually knew about him. The foundational story of the Harley Race legend begins in 1961. Race was in a catastrophic car accident. The crash killed his pregnant wife. The injuries to Race himself were severe enough that the surgeons treating him were prepared to amputate his leg. They had made that clinical decision, and they were ready to proceed. A man named Karras, who was Race's employer at the time, was at that hospital. When the surgeons moved forward, Karras stood at the door and blocked them. He told them that amputation would happen over my dead body. Race kept his leg. The medical professionals who treated him told him he would never walk again. He came back and became the dominant champion of the territory era. Foley does not tell this story as a feel-good tale of inspiration. One, he tells it as direct evidence of something built into Race's character at the deepest level. A man who had lost his wife in that same crash, whose own body was damaged enough that qualified surgeons were prepared to remove a limb, and who was told clearly that his walking days were over, disagreed with all of that. Not outwardly or dramatically, just in the way he lived. He went back to wrestling, and he dominated. The second Race story Foley returns to most often is smaller in scale, but equally revealing about who Race was. It happened in Baltimore. Foley had split his eyebrow open on a guardrail during a spot with Steiner. The injury occurred outside the ring. Because of that technical detail, the Maryland Athletic Commission was taking the position that they were not responsible for the medical bill. The guardrail was outside the ropes and therefore outside their coverage. It was a defensible position on a technicality. Race was watching from ringside. He walked over to the ringside doctor and said quietly, with no raised voice and no dramatic gesture, "It was a headbutt, and it happened inside the ring." The doctor tried to correct him. Race repeated the statement. The same words, the same calm delivery. The doctor immediately conceded, and the bill was covered. Nothing physical happened. No ultimatum issued in a loud or threatening way. Race told a professional what the reality was going to be, and the professional adjusted. That is a specific kind of social authority that is nearly impossible to manufacture. It comes from being, for decades, the most capable and most respected person in every room you occupy. And it comes from every person in that room knowing it without needing to be reminded. Foley's admiration for Race covers both stories because together they represent the two sides of his toughness. The physical side, surviving what was supposed to be unsurvivable and coming back more dominant than before, and the social side, the ability to reshape a situation through presence and calm certainty alone, without requiring a scene or a confrontation. There is also the connection back to Andre the Giant. Andre reportedly feared only two men in that locker room. Haku was one, as we discussed. Harley Race was the other. Two different men representing two different reasons. Haku's standing was about raw physical unpredictability. Race's standing was about something older and perhaps more complete. The authority that accumulates in a man who has survived what he was not supposed to survive and who has never once behaved as though that was remarkable. The Undertaker comparison with Race is direct. Undertaker commands locker room respect that is real and well-earned. Nobody who understands that business seriously disputes it. But what Race had in a room was tied to something more specific than reputation. It was tied to what every person present knew he had lived through and what he had become because of it. Undertaker's standing comes from a career built through craft and commitment. Race's came from a quality that was forged in a hospital room in 1961 and never diminished. From number 4, we moved to two men who operated as a single unit and who brought a specific, relentless physical standard to every match they worked. So number 3, the Steiner brothers. Rick and Scott Steiner came from legitimate amateur wrestling backgrounds, and they brought every ounce of that credibility into professional wrestling with them. Foley includes them as a single entry on his list because his experience of them was always collective. You did not go to work against one Steiner in isolation. You went to work against their standard, their pace, their expectation of what a match was supposed to feel like physically. And if you were not prepared for that standard from the first bell, they would simply run straight through you. Foley's first real encounter with the Steiners happened in 1989 in WCW when he was working as Cactus Jack. He was booked in what was described to him as a tryout match. He came in expecting a professional encounter. What he walked into, in his own words, was a slaughter. The Steiners were not malicious in any premeditated sense. They were not out to deliberately end anyone's career, but they had a very particular standard for what physical reality in a match looked and felt like, and they held to that standard regardless of who was across from them. Their amateur backgrounds meant they were trained to move hard and to apply actual force. That snug style, the term for working with real impact rather than theatrical approximation, places an enormous physical demand on whoever you are sharing the ring with. The Steiners brought that demand to every match and expected you to meet it without adjustments being made for you. Foley has said something specific about the Steiners that is worth paying attention to. He has said on multiple occasions that he learned how to properly take a bump out of sheer necessity during his time working with them. A bump is what wrestlers call the act of absorbing a move and landing without serious injury. It is a foundational skill. Foley was not a beginner when he crossed paths with the Steiners, but their pace and their impact forced him to refine what he knew under actual pressure rather than controlled conditions. If he did not position himself precisely or react fast enough, the Steiners did not slow down to accommodate the gap. They continued at their own pace, and he had to find a way to survive the difference. One specific incident stood out among the others. Rick Steiner hit Foley with such reckless abandon that it left Foley concussed and genuinely questioning whether this was a career path he could sustain. When he asked Rick why he was going so hard on a performer who was working to support the locker room's top names, Rick's answer was direct. He thought Foley was going to take liberties with him, so he acted first to establish the terms. That logic, hitting first because you assume the other person might take advantage if you do not, is a product of the specific environment that WCW was in the late 1980s. It was an era where proving yourself physically was not optional. The locker room had a hierarchy built on toughness, and the Steiners were near the top of it. Getting through them was not a formality, it was the price of admission. What makes the Steiners category distinct from the others on this list is a specific quality of relentlessness. Haku's danger was constant but passive. Vader hit the hardest. Race had the iron will and the social authority. The Steiners brought a consistent physical intensity to every match, regardless of who the opponent was, regardless of how significant or insignificant the match was, regardless of any external factor. That baseline of impact did not vary based on circumstances. It was simply always there. And then the relationship changed. After the initial brutality of those early encounters, a genuine mutual respect developed between Foley and the Steiners, with Rick in particular. Rick Steiner became one of Foley's most vocal advocates backstage. He regularly encouraged other wrestlers to watch Foley's matches because of the punishment he was willing to absorb and the way he kept going regardless. The slaughter became a foundation, the brutality became respect. That is how the Steiners operated. They put you through something genuinely difficult, and if you came through it intact, they acknowledged you for it. The Undertaker comparison with the Steiners is about consistency of impact specifically. Undertaker's matches can be intensely physical. In the right situation against the right opponent, a match with Undertaker can carry genuine risk. But the Steiners brought that level of physical intensity as a default across the full range of matches they worked, regardless of opponent or context or importance. It was not a mode they shifted into for special occasions. It was simply how they operated. That consistency, that unchanging standard, is exactly what Foley is recognizing when he includes them here. From number 3, we move into territory that takes the concept of what a person is willing to endure to somewhere almost beyond rational comprehension. Number 2, Terry Funk. Terry Funk sits at number 2 on this list for a reason that goes well beyond what he could do physically at any given moment. Because physically, by the time Foley was working with him, most significantly, Funk was not the most imposing person in the room. He was not the biggest. He was not the youngest. He was a man in his 50s who had been wrestling professionally for decades and whose body had accumulated an enormous amount of mileage. And yet, when he was in the ring, something happened that defied all of that. Something that Foley has returned to repeatedly when trying to explain what kind of toughness Funk actually represented. And the relationship between Foley and Funk was that of a student with a mentor, at least in terms of how Foley came to understand the philosophy of hardcore wrestling and the psychology behind it. Funk demonstrated that you did not have to be the strongest or the youngest or the most technically accomplished. You had to be willing to go somewhere the audience could not believe you were actually going, and then you had to go there without flinching. The moment that defines the Foley and Funk story is specific, and every detail of it matters. August 20th, 1995. Kawasaki, Japan. The IWA King of the Deathmatch tournament. Foley, working as Cactus Jack, faced Funk in the final of that tournament in a match whose official name tells you everything you need to know before a single word of description is added. And the official name written on the card was the no-rope barbed wire, exploding barbed wire board, exploding ring time bomb deathmatch. Those words are not descriptions. They are the contents of what happened. There were no ropes. In their place, barbed wire had been strung around the ring. Boards wrapped in barbed wire were positioned at ringside, and wired into the ring structure itself were actual C4 explosive charges, set to detonate on a timer during the match. Foley was genuinely terrified of the explosives from the morning of the event. He has described a demonstration stage to show how the charges worked, and the concussive force from even a single C4 explosion was enough to nearly knock him off his feet from a distance. He was scared in a way that was not performed for the audience or played up for interviews later. He was scared of what those explosives were going to do to his body when they went off at close range. He had spent the entire morning knowing that he was going to be in the ring when they detonated. He did the match anyway. That is courage. He felt every second of the fear and went ahead regardless. That is the specific word Foley uses for himself in this situation. But here is the part that puts Funk at number 2. It was not Foley who wanted more explosives. It was Terry Funk. Looking at the setup as it stood, Funk in his 50s, having already accumulated decades of damage in his body, insisted on adding more C4 charges to the center of the ring. He wanted more explosions, more risk, more reality for the audience, not less, more. And the man asking for more explosives was old enough to be a grandfather. Now, both men took real burns during that match. Foley's arm was severely burnt by one of the C4 charges. When he returned home, the smell of burnt flesh was still on him to the degree that his wife noticed it immediately. The lacerations were deep, the burns were genuine, and they were paid $300 for the event. $300 for an exploding barbed wire death match with real C4 in Japan, where the smell of burnt flesh reached the crowd. Funk was ferocious from start to finish. Foley has described Funk using a specific phrase. He calls him an immortal wrestling lich. The idea behind that image is something that sustains existence beyond all reasonable limits through total devotion to a purpose. For Funk, that purpose was wrestling and the audience's emotional engagement with it. He genuinely believed, took and demonstrated with his own body over and over again that the crowd deserved the most extreme possible version of what he could offer. And he kept offering it well past the point where any rational accounting of his body would have told him to stop. Funk's influence on Foley extended beyond Japan as well. When Foley was preparing for the 1998 Hell in a Cell match, which involved Undertaker, it was Funk who provided the critical, strategic advice. Funk told Foley that the only way to compete with the previous high-profile cell match, the one involving Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, was to start the match on top of the cage. That conversation began as something close to a suggestion and became a plan. Foley has said that by the end of the conversation, neither of them was laughing about it anymore. And that plan produced one of the most replayed moments in the history of professional wrestling. The Undertaker comparison here is the most layered one on this list. Because Undertaker was in that 1998 Hell in a Cell, he was the opponent on the other side of the most famous night of Foley's career. But the thinking behind how Foley approached that night, the strategic and psychological framework for how to make it something that no one would ever forget, came from Terry Funk. Undertaker was in the match. Funk shaped the moment. That distinction says something important about the different ways toughness can express itself and where the real weight of certain nights actually lives. Funk sits at number 2 not simply because of pain tolerance or because of one extraordinary match in Japan. He sits here because of a complete philosophical commitment to going further than any rational person would agree to go for the sake of the story and the audience's experience of it. And he maintained that commitment well into his 50s with C4 explosives for $300 in Japan without hesitation. From number 2, we arrive at the name that surprised the most people when Foley confirmed it in 2025. The name that challenges the very idea of what this list is supposed to measure. Number 1, Shane McMahon. Yes, Shane McMahon, the son of Vince. A man who was never a full-time professional wrestler, a man who did not go through traditional training programs or spend years working independent cards or grinding through the territory system. A man whose appearances, when they came, were sporadic rather than built around a sustained schedule. Foley's confirmation of Shane as the standout name on this list, which he reiterated and expanded on in his 2025 conversation with Chris Van Vliet, genuinely surprised a significant portion of wrestling fans. But once Foley explains the reasoning in full, it is very difficult to argue with. The key is a distinction he draws carefully and deliberately between courage and fearlessness. It is the most important distinction in this entire conversation, and it is worth understanding precisely before the argument can land. Courage is what you exercise when you are afraid. It is the quality that allows you to feel a deep, genuine, physical fear and choose to act in spite of it. The fear response is firing, the alarm in your body is loud, and you do the thing anyway. A courage is a decision made under real pressure. It costs something every time you call on it. Fearlessness is different. Fearlessness means the fear response is simply not present in the first place, not suppressed, not overridden through mental effort, simply absent. Foley knows exactly what his own fear feels like because he has described it with precision and without minimizing it. He was terrified of the 1998 Hell in a Cell, not mildly uncomfortable, terrified. He has said clearly that he spent the entirety of The Undertaker's ring entrance looking down from the top of the cage, running calculations in his head about whether there was any way he could climb back down without destroying his reputation and ruining his career. That was the specific thought process happening while the entrance music played. Not whether to do the spot, so it's whether there was any possible exit from doing it. Foley also has a real, consistent fear of heights that extends well outside professional wrestling. He gets genuinely dizzy and disoriented when driving through mountain passes, specifically through the Sierra Nevadas. The height phobia is not a professional weakness or something that only surfaces in extreme wrestling situations. It is a physiological reality about who he is as a person. And he climbed that cage anyway. He felt every second of that fear, and he climbed. He felt it, and he went through the roof. He felt it, and he climbed back up and went over the edge. That is courage. He felt the full fear response, and he acted regardless. Shane McMahon does not appear to operate that way. Foley has watched Shane approach stunts that would make most professionally trained athletes pause significantly before committing to them. Leaps from the top of the Titan Tower structure, jumps at the Hell in a Cell cage itself, spots that carried very real physical consequences in the event of any miscalculation or failure. And Foley's observation, made carefully and with genuine respect for the distinction he is drawing, is that Shane did not seem to be fighting fear when he performed these things. He did not appear to be running an internal calculation about the risk and choosing to proceed despite it. He appeared to approach those moments with a calm that Foley found striking, specifically because he knew from the inside exactly what the alternative felt like. The physiological absence of the fear response was the apparent inability to be stopped by the same internal alarm that would freeze most human beings at the edge of something genuinely dangerous, is what Foley identifies as Shane's specific and most notable quality. And it is what makes Shane unique on this entire list. Every other name on this countdown is physical. What they could do to a body, how hard they could hit, how much damage they could absorb, how far they were willing to go in pursuit of the match. Shane's attribute is not physical in the same way. It is mental, it is physiological, and it is extraordinarily rare. Here is the direct answer to the thumbnail. The Undertaker's toughness is real. His physical commitment to his craft across 30 years of professional wrestling is genuine and well documented. His career stands as one of the most extraordinary in the history of the sport. Nobody serious disputes any of that. But what Foley is measuring on this list is not overall greatness or legend status. He is measuring specific qualities that he encountered in specific people in specific moments. And Undertaker, for all his greatness, does not sit at the top of those specific categories when you apply the criteria Foley actually uses. Shane is not on this list because of match quality or title history or longevity. He is here because Foley spent enough time around him to observe something that he found genuinely unusual and difficult to replicate. A calm at the edge of danger that most trained, experienced, physically elite performers do not possess. Undertaker earned everything he has through decades of craft. That is worth honoring. But Shane's attribute cannot be earned or trained or built over time. It is either present or it is not. And in Foley's observation, built on years of proximity and a deeply personal knowledge of what genuine fear feels like from the inside, it is present in Shane in a way he has rarely encountered in anyone. Foley's list was built on 6 specific kinds of toughness encountered in 6 specific people across a career that cost him pieces of himself he never recovered. Haku is the most legitimately dangerous human being in any room. Vader hit the hardest with the permanent evidence to prove it. Race had the iron will that survived the unsurvivable, and the quiet social authority that bent reality without raising his voice. The Steiners brought a relentless physical standard that you met or suffered for, and every single time. Funk went further than any rational person should have been willing to go, repeatedly on purpose for the audience. And Shane McMahon simply did not feel the fear that stops everyone else. The Undertaker is a legend, but legends are measured by a different system than the one Foley was applying when he built this list. Understanding that difference is the entire point. If you have not subscribed yet, right now is the moment. Drop a comment below with your pick for the toughest wrestler of all time. Tell us who and tell us why.